Now that we have a basic understanding of what language actually is, let's talk about how we interpret and produce it. How do we understand what others are telling us? And how do we decide how we want to say things to other people? So let's start with processing. Back in Psycho 104, you would have learned about bottom-up and top-down processing, specifically back in the chapter on sensation and perception. But we're going to talk about these types of processing this time specifically as it pertains to language. So let's start with the role of bottom-up processing. So as a reminder, bottom-up processing starts with the individual elements of a stimulus that you can start combining together to form that unified whole. So an example would be this letter B down at the bottom here. We have different parts of our brain that are going to interpret all of the different parts of this letter. So we might have part of our brain recognize the up and down stick bit at the back. We might have another part that recognizes some of the curves here. And we're going to start putting it together. We'll put together all of those individual elements, and we're going to combine it into that unified perception where we realize that it's the letter B. And we can continue moving upward, going from the very basics, the elements that make up the letters. We can move upwards, and we can have letters that combine to make words, and words that combine together to make sentences. So it's kind of like moving up that structural hierarchy of language, where we're building things together, moving from the bottom, the most simple, the most elemental components, and working towards the top. And I talked about visually putting these things together. We can also talk about recognizing something other than a letter. How do you recognize words? Do you immediately recognize a word because you've seen it before? Or do you sound it out? Do you work out the combinations of letters to get the pronunciation of that word? And then how do those words go together, and so on? So yeah, if we're starting simple elements building together to a more complex whole, we're talking about bottom-up processing, which of course leads us to top-down processing, going in the other direction. And for top-down processing, sensory information is going to be interpreted in light of existing knowledge and concepts, ideas, and expectations. So basically, we are going to interpret or make sense of the things that we're seeing based on other things that we know. So instead of that letter B and thinking about, okay, so this is the letter B, and next is the letter A, and then the next one is the letter T, we would look at the word as a whole and immediately recognize that it's bat, and we could move on from there. Or we could look at the word as a whole, it's the word bat, and maybe we can break it down. It's like, oh yeah, the word bat is made up of the letters B, and then A, and then T. So we're starting already at the top here, and we could break it down into simpler elements if we wanted to, but a lot of times you don't really need to. You're interpreting things in context, in the knowledge of that things that we already know. Maybe that's sufficient. Maybe you recognize the word bat and you can move on to the next word. And so even though that bottom-up processing can be very useful if you're encountering new things you've never seen before, top-down processing is very efficient for things that you've seen before, for interpreting things in context that you have experience with. And in the case of language ends up being a largely top-down process. The things that we're going to see, write, sign, or hear, they're all making use of our pre-existing knowledge, making use of our vocabulary, our knowledge of grammar and rules, knowing which words tend to go together. That's all part of our top-down processing. That's part of our existing knowledge and pool of information that we have to easily access. Another example of this top-down processing that we can talk about is called speech segmentation. And that's just how we perceive where each word within a spoken sentence begins and ends. So how do we know what words are being spoken? How do we break those sounds down into distinctive words? That's speech segmentation. So let's think back to a time that you heard somebody speaking a language that you yourself don't speak. When you listen to someone speaking that unfamiliar language, it might be hard to actually tell where one word ends and the next one begins. It kind of just sounds like a constant flow of sounds that you can't really interpret. But as you're sitting here listening to me speak a language that you are familiar with, it isn't too difficult for you to break down a sentence, all of the words that I'm speaking, into those individual words. And this process allows you to do some pretty amazing things. So, for example, in this lecture, you may have heard words that you aren't familiar with. And despite the fact that you aren't familiar with those words, you're able to use the context of the sentence, your understanding of the rest of the words that I've said, to figure out which sounds make up that extra word. So you can interpret that previously unknown word in the context of the rest of the sentence. And so this ability to chop up what you're hearing and recognize each of those different pieces as words is speech segmentation. So that's how it works. And it's really cool to think of the fact that as humans, we're very good at speech segmentation. If you hear someone speaking to you in a language you understand, you're automatically doing it, and we're really good at it. But even though we have all sorts of advancements in voice recognition technology and computers learning to listen to people, computers are actually really bad at speech segmentation. So what is it exactly that makes it so hard for computers to figure out how to break down speech into individual words? Why can we do it and computers struggle with it? And the basic idea is that spoken language is very different from written language. If you look at the words on the screen here, there are spaces, clear breaks between each word. And those spaces allow us to immediately and quickly recognize where one word stops and the next begins. But in spoken language, it's kind of deceptive. We don't have those same breaks, at least not in the same way and not as clear cut. So when we listen to speech, if you were analyzing speech using some kind of computer screen or something like that, maybe you're looking at waveforms, which I have done a lot of, you can actually look at the energy in those vocalizations, how much amplitude is in the sound waves that are being produced. And looking at human speech, there are decreases in energy, those sort of drop downs in how much energy is being produced. But the problem here is that you have decreases both within and between words. So there are small decreases between words. So if I say sensory information, there is a gap, a decrease in energy between those two words. But sometimes, and actually a lot of times, there are decreases within words. These decreases are created by differential stresses put on different syllables. So sensory, and there's that drop off in the second part of the word. That decrease is sometimes larger and more noticeable than the gap between words. And so if a computer is trying to use decreases in vocal energy to determine where one word stops and the next starts, it might be breaking up words that should be kept together. The other problem you run into is the fact that when we're saying things, we're aware that other humans can kind of figure out what we're saying, even if we happen to speak just a little bit quickly. And so sometimes the gap between words is very, very brief. The words sort of bleed together. If you're not carefully enunciating each word and leaving an intentional gap, then your words start stringing together. They're all close together and you can't hear the gaps between the words. So a computer isn't very good at picking those apart. And so if those characteristics, if those traits are causing problems for computers, why aren't they causing problems for humans? How do we manage to tell those words apart? And there's two basic things that we use to do this. The first is that we have experience and we have a knowledge of the rules of the language that we speak. So we know that you don't tend to hear certain sounds together in a single word. So let's come up here and we can look at this. So if you were saying concepts, ideas, and expectations, this septs, all of those together, maybe you wouldn't expect to see an I immediately after that. So you'd be like, okay, well, that CEPTS is probably the end of a word because it doesn't make sense to have that PTS, ID, EAS all in one word together. You have those rules of, yeah, those sounds should be separate because they tend not to be seen together. So having spoken the language a lot, you kind of know that they should be in separate words. Another thing that we can use is actually the context of the rest of the sentence. So you can use all of the other pieces of the words, or the pieces of the sentence, to figure out words that are maybe ambiguous. So if you heard the beginning of the sentence, and then you got lost a little bit in the middle, maybe the person started mumbling or speaking too quickly, you can figure it out logically, what those sounds might be based on what you've heard already. So we tend to be a lot better at correctly identifying individual sounds or individual words when there's more information provided to us. So if you gave a person, say, 6 syllables and they had to identify the last syllable, they would do a lot better than if you only gave them 2 syllables and they had to identify the last syllable. So more information is better for us to figure out what's going on. The caveat there is that we only get more information from it if that information is relevant. You can't just throw random syllables at someone. They would have to be syllables that make up a word, like information. Maybe you could figure out the mation part because you heard the in-for at the beginning. So we can build on context to figure things out logically. And our big take-home message with all of this is that the breaks in our spoken language, those decreases in energy output that we're making, don't necessarily map very well to these nice clean spaces that we have in our written language. And that's what creates some problems when you're trying to teach a computer program to break spoken words down into actual individual written words. They're not as good at it as we are because humans are specialized to do these things. We can keep talking about the importance of context when we're dealing with language by bringing it over to pragmatics. And pragmatics is a knowledge of the practical aspects of using a language. So when we're talking about different things, when we have that sort of surface versus deep structure, when you're trying to figure out what the deep structure is, what the meaning is of what someone is saying, the context matters, and especially the social context. So who's asking you or who's talking to you, and where are they doing that, and what way are they talking to you, and what else have they said recently? All of these things come together to make make an effect or they make a difference on what it is that you're going to interpret their words as meaning. So let's use the example here of, do you have the time? So first off, if somebody stopped you on the side of the road and asked, do you have the time? You might say yes, because you know that they're asking, what time is it? And the social implication is that they're asking you to tell them what time it is. They're not just asking, do you know what time it is? To which you could reply yes and continue walking, because they didn't actually ask you to tell them what time it was. But there's that social understanding, that deep meaning, that idea where they're asking you, what time is it, and can you tell me what time it is? But, being asked, do you have the time, in a different context, maybe it isn't someone stopping you on the side of the street and you immediately assume they're asking you what time it is. Maybe you come to someone in their office hours and you ask, do you have the time? Maybe you're asking, do you have the time to discuss this concept? Do you have the time to go for coffee? What were you talking about right before you asked the question? So this is why we're saying that context matters, that surface structure is fairly ambiguous until we know the context. We can't get at that deep structure. We can't get at the meaning of what's being said until we have a little bit better understanding of the context, what else is going on. And we can take from this the idea that there's a lot more to communication than just having a vocabulary and the grammar to correctly arrange words. You have to have an understanding of context. There has to be more to it. Because context matters so much, and because there's so much more going on than just the words that you're saying, we have to be really careful sometimes when we're speaking or communicating that we're actually making a message clear. And in fact, one of the mostly agreed upon rules of communication is that one of our main goals while communicating is to make sure that the message that we're trying to get across comes across clearly. And that sounds kind of simple on the surface. If you want to be clear in your speaking, then you're just going to make it very obvious what it is you're saying. But again, we got to think about more than just the words. Clarity can actually depend on who you're trying to target. Who's the audience that you're trying to get this message across to? The people that you're trying to speak to might cause you to change how you're saying the thing that you're saying. If your audience is a child, if you're trying to get a message across to a toddler, you're going to speak just a little bit differently. Maybe you're going to use simpler words. Maybe you're going to use words that you know that they know. What if your target audience is an expert, someone in a field of, say, psychology? You would then be able to change the words that you're using to be more precise. And you would know that they know those words too, so you can use more complicated words, more specialized terms to be more clear in your communication. And it's not just the choice of words to get a point across clearly. We also have that added complexity with social interactions where the tone of what you're saying can change. So how formal are you in what you're saying? So again, it's going to vary depending on your target. Are you speaking to a parent? Maybe you're going to have a respectful tone. Maybe you're speaking to a friend and you can be more relaxed and casual, and maybe you can rely on some inside jokes where you don't have to explain every detail because you have some shortcuts there. Or maybe you're speaking to a supervisor, so you would have to have a formal tone. And in each of these cases, even if you were trying to get the same message across, you could choose to get that message across in different ways. So in each of those cases, you might have that same deep structure, that same meaning, but the way that you got there, that surface structure, would be different in each case. And if we talk about someone using the wrong tone when communicating, we could call that a violation of pragmatics, because they're using language incorrectly. They're breaking some of those social rules. So if you were talking informally to your supervisor, that would be a violation of pragmatics if your supervisor expects you to speak to them formally. All right, we're going to hop topics just a little bit here. We're going to move on to talking about the parts of the brain that are involved in language, this production and perception of language. And while we're talking about the brain and where we're producing and perceiving language, we're going to talk about some sex differences as well. So this image here might be familiar to you from back in Psycho 104, where we were talking about all of the different areas of the brain, where our cortexes are, where our different lobes are. And for this diagram, the only part that we really care about are going to be Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So the little orange spot here and the blue spot here. So let's start with Broca's area, the orange one on the front here. So Broca's area is mostly located on the left hemisphere of the brain, so on the left side of your brain, and right at the back of your frontal lobe. So this, actually, grab my highlighting here. This chunk here is our frontal lobe. So Broca's area falls right in that. And Broca's area is involved in speech formation. So this is how we're able to form and produce the things that we want to say. And a little bit interestingly, this is located right up against our primary motor cortex, this blue strip up the edge of the frontal lobe there. It overlaps just a little bit at the bottom here. And the place that it overlaps is actually the part of your motor cortex that controls your hands. So people who speak with their hands might be doing that because the part of our brain that's responsible for speech formation is really close to the part of our brain that controls our hand movements. So both might be activated at the same time. So that might help explain why we use our hands so much when we're talking to try and help get a point across. And in this part of our brain, studies have found that people who have thicker cortex in this area, so basically people who have more brain matter in this part of their brain, actually end up having better grammar learning ability. So they do better at learning grammar, which kind of makes sense because they're having more neurons in the part of their brain that's responsible for forming speech, for actually producing or articulating what they want to say. Next, we're going to talk about Wernicke's area, and this is in this rear part of our temporal lobe. And again, I can grab my highlighter here. So our temporal lobe just being this yellow bit on the side. And so Wernicke's area is right in our temporal lobe, and it's part of our speech comprehension. It's in how we understand speech. And for both Broca's area and Wernicke's area, if you end up having damage to either of those areas, maybe you suffer brain damage, you have a concussion, some kind of trauma, damage to either of those areas could be called aphasia. So damaging the tissue in either of those areas. And aphasia could be either permanent or temporary. If the damage is severe enough, aphasia can actually restrict or completely eliminate your ability to form speech. Or if it's in this part of the brain, it could affect your ability to understand speech. If any of you are fans of the TV show House, there's an episode where House deals with a patient who has aphasia that affects his Broca's area, where speech formation happens. And the patient isn't able to put together words that make sense. So this patient can perfectly understand what's going on because there's no problem with Wernicke's area, but the aphasia to Broca's area has reduced their ability to communicate because they can't produce speech. Just a little aside because I very much enjoy that show. And one more cool thing that we can talk about with the brain is that at the back of our brain here in the occipital lobe, this little bit at the very back of your skull, this is where our primary visual cortex is. And if we're looking at written language, so if we're reading a book or right now as you're watching the screen, that part of your brain is going to light up because you are looking at words. So our visual cortex lights up when we see things like words. And the really cool part is that studies have found that children blind since birth, so children who have never actually used their visual cortex because they have never been able to see, you'll still see activation in this part of their brain associated with the visual cortex when they hear spoken language. And what people have concluded is that what's gone on is an adaptation where plasticity or this flexibility in our brains has allowed the brain to adapt and make use of part of the brain that wasn't being used. So in children who cannot see and have never been able to see, this part of their brain never really specialized for interpreting visual stimuli. And instead, the brain started making use of this unused area to help interpret auditory stimuli instead. So just an interesting bit where our brains can be very flexible and adapt in those odd scenarios. And again, for those of you who are visual, we can actually look at these PET scans showing activation in the brain when different activities related to language are going on. So we can see this part of the brain lighting up when people are hearing words, and we can flip back where that area lights up with Wernicke's area. So you're hearing words, you are understanding speech, your Wernicke's area lights up. And here we have this speaking words where your Broca's area lights up, and a little bit up into that motor cortex as well. So here and up a little way. And seeing words, we're having some activation towards the back in our occipital lobe, towards our visual cortex. And generating words is a little bit more forward. So this is a little bit more than what we talk about here. But this is the idea of generating words is when you are thinking about what you're going to say. And speaking is when you're actually producing those words. So I have my little highlighter here. So it's the idea of going from thinking about what you're going to say, generating and forming that speech in the Broca's area, and then having that activation move up into the part of your motor cortex that is actually just moving your mouth to make the sounds that you've thought about saying. And that's why we see such close relationships between these two areas when we're generating and speaking words. And if it wasn't completely clear, we're looking for these areas of sort of white and red as being high activation, and everywhere else being low activation. So we're focusing in on these bright spots as areas that are being involved in these different processes. All right, and I also promised a brief discussion of sex differences while we're talking about the parts of the brain that are involved in perceiving and producing speech. And as you might expect, because I bothered to mention it, there are neural systems, or our neural systems seem to show slightly different organization between males and females. So basically, male and female brains tend to be slightly different in their layout when it comes to speech production and speech perception. And so what evidence do we have to support this claim of sex differences in this organization of our brains? The first we can look at is what happens when people suffer damage to their left hemisphere. So usually in the case of something like a stroke, where blood flow backs up in the brain and can actually cause permanent damage to parts of the brain. So we could look at people who specifically suffered damage to their left hemisphere, to the part of the brain that would have that Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and see what happens to people who have suffered damage to those areas. And most of the time in males, we're going to see more aphasic symptoms. So having an aphasia, that damage to those areas. So this basically means that men who have left hemisphere damage tend to have more problems with speech production and speech perception. So after a stroke, males have a higher chance of their language abilities being negatively affected. And on the other hand, the same kind of damage in females, they tend to see less damage to their language skills. So even though they would have the same kind of brain damage, even if the damage was in the same part of the brain, females were still able to produce and perceive language, and they did it much better than males who had similar damage. And this led people to have the idea that maybe in females, language abilities are a little bit more shared between hemispheres. So back in 104, you would have talked about hemispheric lateralization, the idea that one side of your brain would be really good at something and the other side wouldn't. So this is saying that males would have hemispheric lateralization, where the left side of their brain is responsible for a lot of their language abilities, Wernicke's and Broca's area, and their production and perception of language. But in females, you wouldn't see as strong of lateralization. You would see a generalization, where the ability to produce and perceive language would be shared between both hemispheres. So in females, you're more likely to see right hemisphere involvement in language production and perception. And we actually see evidence of this when we look at fMRI scans. So if we're looking at brain activation, kind of similar to the PET scans we were just looking at, we can look at, this would be a representative male brain, where we would see activation on this side. This would be the Wernicke's area, where you're hearing language, you're starting to understand language, and you're seeing only activation on the left side in males. So that lateralization, only the left side being involved. And in females, hearing speech, you see activation on both sides. So you end up with this generalization where both hemispheres are active, not just one. And so that's our evidence for sex differences in our production and perception of language.